The challenge was set for me to do 9 dungeons in one stream. In this video I decided to see how I can smash through each dungeon using Sentinel Shield and rate the fastest, easiest and best for loot with some cheeses you can use for each one. Here's 9 hours of my life condensed to about 15 minutes or so, mixed with my typical crazy, super deep dive lore facts about each dungeon whilst I'm running them. I'm going to start at the end. Vespers Host was in hour 9, and in honesty, I was hanging on the last thread of sanity I had. I kicked off the final dungeon by explaining what a taint was to my team. Essential dungeon run info.
A taint?
Yeah. You don't know what a taint is?
It's a new one.
By now I'd also learned that my very trusty Sentinel was very situational, throwing up problems for any boss that was at a distance, so in the final encounter I would need to change up the strategy. But first up, I could smash my way through the small and big ass brig that dropped in. I was golden. Up close and personal was where Sentinel really delivered. The mechanics of Vespers are like an evolved version of Deepstone Crypt, so once you know, it's about identifying the right panels, shooting them, and later on carry nuclear cores, storage containers. It's basically most of it solved. The dungeon took us about an hour. I was on ad clear, as in the end my brain couldn't handle much, in honesty. The last encounter I had to change up my loadout to Thunder Crash with Curious of the Fallen Star on an Arc build. I think I ran Bittersweet heavy with a bait and switch and envious Arsenal roll. What we find in Vesper Station isn't the actual Atrax, but a disused clone exobody that floated into the station at some point. Atrax was the first Elixni to become an exo, and to help her deal with not having an organic body anymore, she got her subordinates to wear her previous face on them. But this wasn't too bad, since we managed to get the Vakris exotic out of it, so happy days. The best 2 supers for the second encounter servitor boss are Glacial Quake and Song of Flame because of the shatters and infinite ignitions, so freeze them and blow them up strategy is perfect here. Easily the fastest dungeon in the game. We got done in 26 minutes and we weren't really rushing ourselves at all. Shattered Throne was the very first dungeon that we breezed into early that morning, fresh as a daisy. Honestly, I ran some of the dungeon for Wish Ender, but never kind of bothered to finish it. The Ascendant Realm is always dark as shit and hard to see where I'm supposed to go at the best of times. Coupled with the loot being very poor, I just never gave much of a thought to it until I ran it for Wish Ender, which is a bow everyone should have, full stop. Before the bow got a bit of a nerf, it was my go-to for comp, but these days I mostly use it for endgame where I need to pop a barrier champ. Shattered Thrones, large open spaces and long corridors make it really suitable for long range weapons. They just make a better pick. Sniper rifles, pulses, and even scouts have a better place in the dungeon due to how large its encounter spaces are. Thunderlord or Sleeper Simulant are very suitable for most of the dungeon due to the range and effectiveness against a wide range of enemies the player will face. Plus obviously Wish Ender is great for taking down those sniping ads that will quietly pick at you from higher levels. This is the dungeon where we get to murder Savathun's daughter, Dul Inkaru, the Eternal Return, as she serves as the final encounter boss in Shattered Throne. Here's a low-key tip, that if you pair Witherhoard and Wish Ender, there's like a 25% hidden damage bonus against targets blighted with Witherhoard, due to the weapon dealing damage bonus against taken targets. The only real thing I wanted to do here in Prophesy was use my skimmer all the way through that ribbon road thing near the last encounter. Let's just say that didn't go quite as planned, and I needed to be pulled into the encounter as I just plain gave up trying to skimmer that mofo. There's no exotic to farm in this dungeon, and in my opinion the loot is just pretty mid, so I don't usually drop into it, so that's why it gets a C rating for a dungeon for me. But if you love the simple mechanics and a quicker run, then you go for it. The actual mechanics here were a replicate of what we see in the final shape actually comes from this out to the final shape. So you should be able to get into it pretty easily if this is a new one for you, but essentially standing in bright areas gives you light motes and standing in dark gives you dark motes. That's the whole thing. The Kel Echo at the very end is a taken projection of a fallen Kel, conjured by the Nine as an obstacle to show the Guardian that by using dark and light together, their combined power is the means to survival in the battle against the darkness. So this early dungeon, like Dredge and Yore, was showing us that combining light and dark was the answer to all our problems. Our one and only dungeon based around the Nine, the only thing this group of non-corporeal beings have ever been interested in is creating physical bodies for themselves. I don't really care much for how they do that. For example, if you haven't checked out the madness that is the space station Cocytus A113, then I encourage you to go check it out, since it's honestly just the strangest place that once occupied by, it seems like, everybody. The second ever dungeon to drop in D2, and now, for me, rates at a C. Since apart from the fun lore, it doesn't deliver on loot and good mechanics and has only one boss, Zulmak. I'd suggest to run this with an arc bow, Trinity Ghoul maybe, and if you have Xenophage then it's a good call. Again, I ran Sentinel since the final boss got up close and personal, so it worked a treat. Technically, it doesn't really have an exotic attached to it if you don't consider a Xenophage, but I suppose you could say the same thing for Shattered Throne and Wish Ender, so it's up to you. Traversing between encounters honestly took up more time than doing the encounters, so that's where most of the time actually went. I can't say this is a favourite dungeon to run, and the loot is balls. So this dungeon needs to get a rework if Bungie were thinking about it as soon as they can. Please, thank you. As it's the very first Hive-focused dungeon introduced to D2, and one of the 3 Hive-focused overall, it feels unique enough visually, and I think it has enough potential to do something with a 5-year-old dungeon where most of its mechanics have been replicated in seasonal content or exotic missions in that time, that it really won't give you too much trouble to work out how stuff works. Once you get to grips with the maze of directions you can go in the beginning. In a way, the dungeon boss Zulmak, Instrument of Torment, is not unlike Atrax of Vespers Host, as the Hive Knight was a reanimated puppet, set to do the bidding of the Daughters of Crota, as they didn't want to risk fighting a Guardian fire team directly. Hive historians and lore are, for me, really fun to read and piece together, and you get a taste of it when you read about Azevath, who first killed Zulmak. The Hive Wizard joined forces with her 2 other siblings to overthrow the powerful Daughters of Crota at the command of the Witch Queen herself. The treacherous trio, consisting of the wizard Malkanath, the Deceiver, and the crippled knight Akrazul, the Severed, embarked on a forbidden ritual called the Inquisition of Self in a twist of fate. Akrazul's essence was to be placed within Azevath's body, but the outcome was far from what they anticipated. During the ritual, Azevath was granted haunting visions of the Death Song's origins and the mystical choir who sang its deadly melody. A melody that could tear planets in half from just the singing of it. However, the fusion of Akrazul and Azevath could not be contained, leading to a chaotic rampage that ended in the gruesome deaths of Malkanath and Zulmak, our pit champion here. Savathun managed to get her essence right back, and then she became Azevath, reborn as Ir Aram, the newly formed Death Singer. Guided by the Witch Queen, Ir Aram sought to rebuild the choir and erase the memory of their failed abomination with her own unique song of destruction. This was the first dungeon that I remember that Bungie decided to put deliberate traps in, just to entertain other members of the fire team, it seems. Misleading and fun, there are so many videos of Guardians getting slammed with these early traps and it sets out a trope Destiny has used a few times in future dungeons. Yes, I'm looking at you, Warlord's Ruin. Okay, at the first encounter, in Grasp, we meet Frisia, the Insatiable, who is a massive hive ogre that a lot of streamers use to test new builds and weapons against. It seems the ogre doesn't stay dead, like most hive things in D2, as we see her again in a heroic public event in Savathûn's Throne World and also in the Ritual, the final mission in the Witch Queen campaign. They're just so resilient. The most straightforward tip to offer in Grasp is the easiest way to deal with the Shank, an invisible guy, during the final boss fight, which is to put a well at the door where the boss spawns in and nuke them as they come out. This also makes it easier to collect the other engrams on the outer edges without getting sniped. Cursed engrams provide the context for the dungeon and tell the story, if you go looking for it, of the final fire team that went into the original loot cave that turned against each other, being infected by the curse placed upon these engrams. In the end, nobody left that cave, setting up the loot here that will turn you against your fire team and send you into a rage that leads to the final death. In lores anyway. In game it's a bit harder to pull off, so it doesn't actually work like that. Duality. I really kinda hate this one. I've just never enjoyed this dungeon. I don't like the mechanics, I don't like the aesthetics of it. The swapping between reality to Mindscape reality was a nice idea, just didn't really come off well. I just thought the harsh red tones was awful to play with and play in. Maybe you like it, but I just never enjoyed playing it. So I'm going to rush through this one. Here's a little cheese for the Duality dungeon if you've already ran it a few times. At the first encounter, when you go into the rooms to collect both essences instead, only collect one essence but kill both scions. Next round in, take the second essence but leave the exact same scion alive when the person goes in to kill the Cabal to start off damage phase. The scion that will be in the room with the Cabal, kill it, and you will gain an extra 40 seconds or so of DPS time on the boss. The Nightmare of Keitel is the final boss for this dungeon, something I missed for quite some time, me being stupid. Keitel has always been an interesting character, since we don't actually know if she's real, or if she was conjured as part of a wish by Callus when he was feeling lonely and depressed, which happened quite a bit. She could be real, or she might not be. I'm not sure we'll ever know the difference. Finally, we get to the one and only Vex dungeon that we've ever gotten in the game. The story was straightforward, right? There's a Seraph Spire that's being taken over by robot chickens. Persis, Primordial Ruin, is a Vex Wyvern of the Soul Divisive, encountered as the final boss of Spire. It's one of the 2 Soul Divisive mines sent by the Witness to infiltrate the Ares Spire, which is this Spire, and send it into Overload after stealing its data. The exotic you have here is the Hierarchy of Needs bow, which has another rogue paracausal AI trapped in it. There's so many AI weapons in Destiny at this stage. I guess my best tip for Spire would be that neither boss has an enrage mechanic, so prioritizing staying alive and self-preservation is more key than squeezing out that extra bit of damage. Oryx stays dead. That's the whole deal with this dungeon. They tried to bring him back and failed, and that's what we do in this activity. During the intro sequence, players can spot the maintenance tank, which was used to escape the Hive during the Red War campaign mission Utopia. If you find the consoles hidden around the first encounter area, you can actually summon the tank too, so have at it. By far, this run of Ghosts of the Deep took us way too long. Really, down to nothing but the most annoying final boss that moved about with an overshield that really wasted more supers than we wanted. Also, we had a glitch that made us restart the final encounter, so that just didn't help. The final boss is Simua Ur Nokru, who was a hive wizard who we first met in the penumbral depths during the Strange Terrain mission, after being summoned by a group of 4 knights. Simua had to be defeated to progress. She was then resurrected as a lightbearer and thrown into this encounter to bring back Oryx, though a ritual that Oryx would not have condoned or liked, maybe. In Ghost, it's best to have someone with Arbalest for the big hive wizard at the end, because it will one-shot her overshield and make it quicker to get down into damage. If anyone suggests having a few Thundercrash Titans available for DPS phase, just don't bother. The Warlock tends to move around a lot, and getting that hit can be like threading a needle. We learned that the hard way and spent too much time on the last encounter. Lastly, this is my favourite dungeon to run, and ironically, the one dungeon that has not dropped her exotic for me no matter how many times I run the mofo. A very open and straightforward activity. Just run up the castle and kill things. Or mountains, depends how you look at it. The mechanics were straightforward, offering good loot in the exotic, buried bloodline, and the legendary sidearm with Volt Shot. And not to mention, this was just fun to run, and felt fresh and well thought out with some lovely lore. That's why I'm giving it my A rating. This first ever Scorn dungeon to be dropped in game with Taken and Scorn, so it mixes things up. This entire dungeon run is the fault of Shax, who decided to put the bones of Heffend, the Ahamkara, in the ruins of Dark Age Castle and expected that to be fine. No consequences. Shax murdered that Ahamkara, by the way. The lore here talks of a love story between a warlock, Name, and a dead Ahamkara, Heffend. Name took on all the costs of every wish Heffend had given in his life, so those who made the wish could live happily ever after. This started kind of a loving relationship between the two, even though the Ahamkara was dead. There's one enemy that comes to check you out while you're trapped in the jail cells just after the first encounter. You can hit a finisher on that guy, and if you're close enough to the bars, you can glitch through and escape. But be aware, I've seen this tip backfire on players, so be wary of it. If you're on a hunter from the final boss, try out Shadow Shot, and if you want to use Tether for those eyes that spawn, that speeds up the process. Sentinel Shield was a waste of time for most of this dungeon, since the Chimera proxy for the Ahamkara was at distance, so rendering the super not effective at all. But for the first boss, the first Scorn Captain, it proved really effective. Since Sentinel has been nerfed now, it's not delivering the kind of numbers it did once, but it was great while it lasted. If you're looking for some great tips, lore, and gameplay for all the raids that are currently in rotation in Destiny 2, then I suggest go have a look at my next video, What No One Tells You About Raid Bosses in Destiny 2.
Wow, this has just been such a pleasure. I'm such a lucky boy. I can't wait to go home